we have the wonder drug of all time. Women are talking about it. The medical establishment, who just hasn't been taught this or read the latest papers, they don't know. I take testosterone top up. It's a fantastic hormone that we have been denied and told the wrong story about for centuries. In California, they did a study of women in their 70s and they gave them vaginal estrogen, and they found that halved the rate of urinary tract infections. There is the invisibility that people in large companies are much, much more likely to employ a woman in her 30s than a woman who is 56 to do a job. And there's age bias, but it particularly hits women.
Welcome, Kate, back to the Sex and Space podcast. Very happy to have you here with us again to talk about another book of yours.
Thank you.
And for any of our listeners who haven't had the opportunity yet to listen to one of our prior episodes where you've spoken with us, could you possibly just introduce yourself and what it is that you do?
So my name's Kate Muir. I'm a women's health campaigner. I've written a book on the menopause called Everything You Need to Know About the Menopause, and a book on the pill. And we're going to be talking today about my third book, which is How to Have a Magnificent Midlife Crisis, which is also about hormones too. And I've made a couple of TV documentaries as well here for Channel 4 about the menopause. So causing trouble in the women's health space is my job.
And so I've got a copy of your book, wonderful book here. And so this is what we're here to talk about today. And I wondered if you could tell us what kicked off this specific book for you.
Well, I was out and about talking about menopause to women in the NHS, in banks, at bus stops, my friends. And I suddenly realized there was this huge conversation to be had about midlife and those changes. And it was about things like gender bias and our jobs and our health and our digital health and our sexual health. And it was far bigger than the sort of menopause bit I'd focused on. So I thought, right, all these people are telling me their stories when I'm out and about. I would like to try and give people a sense of how to handle midlife in this time of incredible complexity. And I also think of midlife as maybe from your early 40s up until your 70s, or indeed, why not have a midlife crisis when you're younger? But all these things like sort of digital health and I tried psilocybin, things like that. It was a big experiment on myself and other people. And actually, it's a group work of other women's stories plus the science, because I don't like not to do the science.
And can you talk to us a bit about the way that you've structured the book? It's kind of in sort of body, mind and spirit. Can you talk us through sort of why you made that decision to structure it in that way?
Actually, my editor did that.
Okay.
I was just flying in these chapters to her and she said, "You know what you're doing here?" I said, "I've no idea." And she said, "You've written about mind, you've written about body, you've written about spirit." And it begins with mind because that was very clear to me that there was a real sort of mental health and mental healthiness question around this whole sort of story of how we change as women and how we live much longer. And I really wanted to write about the brain changes in perimenopause and menopause and how our brain completely rewires. And I don't think most people knew this, and I certainly didn't, that, as a woman, if you have a baby, your brain rewires 3 times in life. It rewires at the 3 Ps, it rewires at puberty, it rewires at pregnancy, and it rewires again at perimenopause. And so you come out a different person, because whether or not you take hormone replacement therapy or your brain just changes, it changes shape. It's being fed a different fuel. It's not got the same hormones coming into it. You do different things, whether you become a witch or a crone or an HRT advocate or, change career or give something up. It really is a time where our brains completely alter. And all this time we've been talking about the male midlife crisis. They've been out buying sports cars and generally, giving up relationships. Our midlife crisis is way, way bigger because we lose our fertility. Quite often our families, younger children have left home. We're dealing with aging parents. We've maybe changed our careers to suit other people around us that we're looking after. And then suddenly at this point, we realize we are free. What are we going to do? How are we going to look after ourselves? How are we going to think about ourselves? If you're 50 and you're thinking about the next 50 years, what are you going to do that's useful in that time and fun? So those were all the sort of things I tackled. And I suppose, things like I became a wild swimmer, and about cold swimming. So things like that crossed over between mind and body, really,
Mm.
because it had such a great mental health effect too. So, yeah.
Yeah, those things are all very connected, aren't they? They're kind of, um, blend across all those different categories. I want to come back to what we're talking about hormones. You
Uh-huh.
mentioned that HRT has had the worst PR campaign in the history of the universe, and I wondered if you could talk our listeners through what you mean by that.
Well, HRT was used quite prolifically in America and the UK up until 2002, when a report came out from the World. It's called the WHI report, and it was a
Mm.
huge report on about 16,000 women who were on HRT or not on HRT. Huge amounts of money were spent on it, and they stopped the trial because they said women are getting breast cancer. They've got an increased risk of breast cancer on this HRT. It turned out, one, that was misreporting of the results for a start, and two, that now we have a completely different HRT. So back then it was synthetic and it was made of the same stuff that's in the pill. And now we have body identical HRT, which is made from soy, which is a molecular copy of your own hormones. So it's not putting something weird and alien into your body. If your estrogens run out a bit, you can put a bit more back in and top it up. And it has completely different metabolic effects because it is just a much better product, which you can get here on the NHS, and in places like Australia and America, you can get body identical HRT really easily. It's cheap as chips for medical providers. Makes a huge difference in terms of, your cardiovascular health, your risk of diabetes, your risk of osteoporosis. It's keeping your body younger, not in a kind of jokey way, but keeping the machine working. And when hormones go away, the machine stops working as well as it did. And people have just thought of menopause as a fertility thing. You don't have your periods anymore, so you're not very useful. You can't be a mum. Bye bye, you've got menopause. And actually, it's a huge hormonal and metabolic and mental health event. And
Mm.
I've only realized, I've almost only really grasped the language of explaining that to people as I've been sort of studying this for 5 years and changed the language I've used,
Mm.
And I think that's part of it. We're dealing with old medical language that was written by men in the 1850s in France. And in fact, the word the change is better in a sense because this is
Okay.
about a huge change,
Mm.
mind, body, and spirit.
Yeah, that makes
And
sense.
also in this book, because the menopause book was quite, it was quite serious and serious science and people who were really struggling. This book is really about Renaissance and people who are going through it and then coming up the other side
Mm.
and changing their lives. And so it's got this very positive vibe, and lots of people being quite eccentric and doing kind of crazy things as they grow older and joining communes and things like that as well. But yeah,
Yeah, I like that.
hormones are key, and hormones changing in your brain are really, really key.
And you mentioned that HRT has really positive long-term impacts as well. And I wonder if we could talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of fantastically good news. So, the Menopause Charity has done a big study of this, and you can look it up, but it's the effect of HRT in the long term. So, we all know they stop hot flushes. That's great. And they make your joints feel better. But what we've realized is that hormones build bones, and women's bone density goes down by between 10 and 20% around the perimenopause and menopause. So that is really severe. And
Mm.
1 in 2 women over 50 break a bone due to osteoporosis, due to brittle bones. So one
Wow.
half of women have brittle bones and get an injury. And if it's a serious injury, like you break a hip, people often die afterwards.
Mm.
So we've got this army of women out there on Zimmer frames and, in hospital beds who, if they had been told in their late 40s or early 50s, guess what? HRT will protect your bones. Estrogen helps your bones, and there are things in your bones. Your bones are like trees, like branches of trees, and they grow. They're seasonal. They come and go, and you probably know this, but there are osteoblasts, which kind of blast off the bones, and osteoclasts, which get rid of the stuff in the bones. And so you've got calcium coming out of your bones and feeding the body. Your bones get battered around when you're walking, and they need to be regenerated. So this regeneration process is fueled by estrogen, among other hormones and other things, and calcium and vitamin D and things like that matter too. But estrogen is a key player in bone health. And it makes a huge difference. And I did a big study. I went through all the studies. I got a grant actually. And we realized that just even the almost ordinary HRT was bringing up bone density by 7% over 2 years. I spoke to lots of people who had increased their bone density by 10%, they
Wow.
before and after scans. And we also realized that making women do incredibly heavy weightlifting, not little pink weights, not cute, but so you go and really lift heavy. That ripping lifting moment, and maybe storming up and down stairs or skipping or running, anything that pounds your bones and pounds your body, not walking, can really lift your bone density too. Brings your testosterone up a bit too. And that is really, really helpful. And that alone in a year, if you do some serious working out with weights, that brings your bone density up by 3%. So amazing that we could really get rid of, a 4 billion a year osteoporosis bill
Wow.
for the NHS. Will they listen? No. Are they teaching it to the new surgeons coming through? No. There is a massive bias, and I think it's almost criminal neglect. And then if you look over at dementia, we know that body identical estrogen in your veins, in your arteries, it's basically WD-40. It's oiling your veins. It's helping everything to go through. You're less likely to get clots. You're less likely to get strokes. So that makes a big difference, because the kind of motorways going up to your brain, the blood motorways, are flowing freely, and that lowers your chance of dementia. And that's also about eating the right foods and not getting too much cholesterol and butter and fat and ultra processed food. Everything is HRT plus lifestyle in this
Yeah.
story. But my God, if you put the two together, you could really lower dementia. And the other thing is diabetes. It basically, HRT reduces your risk of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, by 30%.
Wow.
So, here we have the wonder drug of all time. Women are talking about it. The medical establishment, who just hasn't been taught this or read the latest papers, they don't know. And also, a lot of the work I've been doing the papers I'm reading have been written in the last 2 or 3 years. It's not like they're in the curriculum, they're beyond the curriculum. And so it's up to us on our podcasts to make this a digital revolution,
Yeah.
because otherwise it ain't going to happen. And it's up to us to go to our mums and go like, it looks like granny's got osteoporosis. Have you thought about HRT? Hormones make your bones turn over. They keep them going. And women don't know that. I didn't know that. I didn't know it had anything. I thought skeletons were sort of glass things in your body. Do you know what I mean? I didn't think they grew, and I just didn't know. Why would
Yeah.
you?
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Uh,
So if there's someone listening who's going, either that sounds like me, or like I know someone who, maybe should consider this, and people are feeling uncertain about how to bring that conversation up with their doctors, would you have any advice for them?
well, I think the first thing is gather your data. So for people who are in menopause or perimenopause, get a symptom list, and you can get one off the Balance app, or you can go top 20 symptoms of menopause into AI and you'll get a list. Print it out, or take it down, or use one of those apps, and look at the symptoms and think, well, do I have sore joints? I don't have hot flushes. Do I have memory loss? Yes, I do. Is there osteoporosis in my family? Is there heart disease in my family? Look at all those things, and then you can go to your doctor and say, look, I've got sore joints, I've got hot flushes, I'm really interested in starting HRT. I'd like to see whether it suits me, whether it works. It doesn't always work straight away, and you have to often change the amounts. But take in your data, I think, would be the thing. Also, often take someone with you, like
Okay.
a friend, a girlfriend, or partner, or whatever. because often advocating for yourself is really difficult. I think
Mm,
if a
mm,
doctor is difficult, and you're also absolutely entitled to a second opinion if someone says, "Oh no, you can't have that."
mm.
Um, I mean, most doctors know their stuff now. Most doctors
Yeah.
do prescribe it, but they don't understand the long-term implications of it. And if you went in age 60 thinking, oh my God, my bone density's gone down, I've just broken my wrist, I'd like to start HRT, the doctor would be going, oh, you're past menopause now, you don't need to do that. Here's a scary osteoporosis drug that will make your bones really hard. Actually, HRT is much better because it keeps the bones kind of rubbery and flexible
Okay.
and more natural.
Mm,
And so you'd have to possibly advocate really hard if you wanted to start HRT later. But
mm.
why not? You can start it at a low dose so your body doesn't suddenly go, oh my God, I've got lots of hormones.
Yeah.
You can start it gently. And that can make a huge difference. Even very low dose HRT makes a huge difference for osteoporosis. And when
Wow.
we're thinking about 1 in 2 women,
That's
it's
significant.
just
That's
it's a
huge.
health disaster that we can stop, but
Mm.
we're not bothering to do anything about. And my plan is to kidnap Wes Streeting, our health minister, and hold him somewhere for 5 minutes and just explain bones are made, work with hormones. If we give women the safe HRT, we will reduce their risk of fracture. You can save billions. That
Yeah.
is my plan.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do it, but we'll work on
Yeah.
this together. But I mean, it's so daft that we aren't dealing with that.
Mm. And to get our listeners to contribute some ideas on how to execute this plan. In terms of vaginal estrogen, which is something else you mentioned in the book, what is something you would want people to know about that?
Oh, I love vaginal. It's my favorite thing. Absolutely
Okay.
fantastic. So the thing about vaginal estrogen is, well, for a start, you lose collagen when you go into menopause and early menopause too, and you lose about 15% of collagen. And if you think that's happening on your face, you're buying Chanel, you're spending lots of money. Are you doing anything about your vagina, your vulva? No, you're not. Exactly the same thing is happening there. It's
Mm,
drying up, it's shrinking, your clitoris is shrinking, it's shriveling up down there. If you're on systemic HRT, full body HRT, that often doesn't happen because you've still got it running, but sometimes you need both. And for people who are not on HRT, they should very much get hold of some vaginal estrogen. And it should
mm,
be vulval estrogen, actually, because it's for all over. And one of the great things is
mm.
the estrogen, you stick a bit down there in a cream or a gel or whatever, or a pessary, and it affects the urethra. So
Okay.
all your bladder and there's a whole thing down there, and I love this, called the vaginal microbiome.
Mm,
And of course, we've had all the chat from Tim Spector about the stomach microbiome and how we should be eating probiotics and this and that and maintaining the good bacteria in our gut. We need to maintain the good bacteria in our vaginas and vulvas and
mm,
urethras. And one of the things that you can do is obviously put this estrogen on, and it really, really helps with urinary tract infections because
mm,
the skin's more elastic, and estrogen helps the good bacteria thrive down there. So if you've got the bad bacteria, like how E. coli is one of them, so the E. coli are fighting the good bacteria,
mm,
and then the E. coli can get dominant and permanently embedded of various kinds. And so it really makes a difference bringing in estrogen. And the other thing I discovered in the book, certainly for me, and I'd had lots and lots of urinary tract infections and lots of big doses of antibiotics, which I think had killed everything that was going on in
mm,
my vaginal biome. And I also took lactobacillus probiotic tablets, which I still take. And the one that seems to suit me is crispatus. There's 4 different really good lactobacilli, and there's crispatus and rhamnosus and this and that. And you can get really a supplement for about 10 quid or whatever,
mm,
which gives you these, and you can take it orally. And I was like, how come if you just take it orally, it affects your vagina and your urethra?
mm.
And the doctor explained to me, she just said, bacteria gets around down there. I was like, okay. But yeah, so it's in your body, it's all happening. So you can make a huge
Yeah.
difference. And there was also a thing for older women, which was in California, they did a study of women in their 70s and they gave them vaginal estrogen, and they found that that halved the rate of urinary tract infections. And
Wow.
it got rid of some altogether in for women in their 70s. And you think of all those poor women in nursing homes dealing with incontinence and all that kind of thing.
Mm,
We could give them back, a really, really healthy vulva, but we don't bother because we don't want to talk about that part of women, and women
mm,
don't want to talk about it. Certainly women of that age are not out there advocating for their vulvas. They probably wouldn't know the word vulva,
mm.
literally. So again, it's a conversation we need to make louder and louder and prevent women getting these UTIs as much as they are doing and just being given antibiotics over the counter,
Mm.
which kill everything down there. So it's really important.
And I guess that's the thing is, being able to take, the supplements and then having that estrogen is like a preventative measure rather than addressing the issue once it's already there.
Yeah.
And then, like you say, killing off all of the bacteria down there
Yeah.
rather than just the
So
bad things.
preventative medicine, brilliant. And it's
Mm,
such a saving, both in terms of sanity and health, but economics. Large scale macroeconomics of the health service in Britain could be changed if people listen to our conversation, literally,
yeah,
And
yeah.
the doctors who are out there talking about this are doing a fantastic job. I do not understand why the policymakers are just sitting there without understanding. I think
Mm.
it's really bad.
There's a lot of work to be done, I think,
Yeah.
to make those
Yeah.
those changes actually, happen. Hi. We wanted to ask you if you could please subscribe to Sex in Space. Every click of that button helps us to keep doing the work that we're doing and bring you more great podcast episodes like this one. Subscribe now. It's safe and it's satisfying. There's another chapter in your book about the importance of being cliterate, which I think is great. And I wondered if you might have any thoughts for our listeners if they're, curious about how they can regain some sexual confidence. What might you say to them?
Well, I mean, I was writing this for older women, really. And one of the things people I was talking to, this fantastic group called Killing Kittens, who have sex positive parties. And the lovely thing, and then they do it all around the country. But the lovely thing about, and there's all sorts of things with kink and this and that and champagne, and you can go to kind of spas and have a party there. But it's run by women, and only women can get the invites. They can bring a man with them if they want, or another woman, but you have to be identified. People need to see your driving license. You need to
Mm,
prove yourself online first. So you don't get a strange bunch of people who are creepy. You've got
mm,
people who are there to have good fun for one night or two or whatever, and come to these parties, and you can watch and get involved, and there's safe spaces, and they've got people looking after people in case anything goes wrong. And it's all about communication and
mm,
having a good time, and they have lots of online events. So that was kind of fun, the idea that suddenly in your late 40s you might just go and meet this group of wild people that you probably wouldn't meet, down the local pub. And that is great fun. I think
mm.
paying a lot of attention to keeping your whole vulva feeling great. So again,
Yeah.
back to the vaginal estrogen and looking after that. And I think the other thing is sort of 50% of women say around menopause that it really affects their sex life, and their testosterone is crashing. And
Mm,
testosterone and estrogen obviously are about libido, and you can get testosterone eventually prescribed on the NHS if you go in and say, my libido is low, I really need help, I'm already on HRT. And testosterone is terrific. It's a female hormone.
mm.
That, but it really, really peaks in our late teens and early 20s. It's our biggest hormone then, but yet we've been denied that this is a female hormone, and we
Yeah.
make more of it than estrogen. But by the time you're 50, 60, 70, it's really, really going down. And I take testosterone top up. Very good fun, if I may say.
It's amazing how there's been this whole narrative about testosterone being a male hormone, and I think there was something you said in the book because it's produced like in the testes and then in women in the ovary, so it could be
Mm.
called ovesterone. I think
Yeah,
you
yeah,
said, which I liked. I was like, we should rebrand
yeah.
rebrand
But
testosterone.
also, we talk about, the trans community, the non-binary community. We talk about people using hormones one way or the other. And I think part of the kind of institutional fear around women taking testosterone is, oh my God, they're going to grow a beard and they'll become part of some, there's a kind of really old-fashioned, creepy repulsion about it, I think.
Mm,
And in fact, you may want to grow a beard or you may just want to have a little bit more sex, and it may help your energy, and it will, and it is a natural female hormone, and you
mm,
can keep taking it at female levels, the level you had it, in your 40s, and it is absolutely safe to take. There are
mm,
no contraindications. There's no risk of breast cancer from it. In fact, possibly the contrary, it might help. So, it's a fantastic hormone that we have been denied and told the wrong story about
mm,
for centuries. And I think almost reclaiming that might change things, a great deal. Other thing, osteoporosis, bones work on estrogen and testosterone. If you've got testosterone, your muscles building up, your bones are building up, the two together work like a little orchestra, looking after your
mm.
bones, looking after your muscles, looking after your brain. So it's the great neglected hormone that we need to give more love to.
It's interesting. It's this work is very much about not only educating people, but kind of rewriting these narratives that we've been fed about
Yeah.
testosterone, about HRT, that have misled people for so long.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, it's the
there's a
language. I keep coming across the language, and I feel I haven't yet fully formed my own language and our language around this. And yeah, menopause is the wrong name.
mm,
Testosterone's almost the wrong name, and it would be interesting to rethink what we've been given
mm.
as our language.
In your digital detox chapter, this one was one of the really, I was funny, I was reading it and you
Mm,
were talking about how if you're working and you even have your phone and your eye line, it distracts you. And I
yeah,
was sitting here reading the book with my phone and my eye line, and I was like, that's probably true.
yeah, yeah.
And one thing I was really interested in was this idea of continuous partial attention, I think, or constant
Oh,
partial
yeah.
attention. And I wondered if you could tell our listeners a bit about that.
I suppose that I mean, I'm not a total expert on this, so I interviewed other experts, but basically we never fully focus on the task in front of us. And you've got to put your phone in a bag in
Mm,
another room and forget about it in order that you're able to focus. And younger people definitely have a lot of trouble focusing for more than about 14 minutes on a specific task or on a book. And I think to lose that power focus is absolutely terrifying. I also think since I wrote the chapter, really, which was about 6 months ago, the amount of people who are completely addicted to AI and playing on AI and using it, and increasingly you just believe what it tells you, and it might be wrong, and it's got this gender bias, this race
mm,
bias, this
mm,
man bias, this, and you are using that constantly. And I mean, I use Perplexity, which is an AI, but it does give you citations, so you can check if
okay.
only there's a scientific paper, but they only interviewed 15 people. Whereas sometimes I find Chat GPT just rolling out this stuff at me, and I don't trust it. But I keep
Mm,
meeting people who are now addicted to AI, and I think for every moment you spend online, you're not living. I think for
mm,
most people, unless it's something wonderful like doing a podcast. But on the whole, where is life? If you're gonna, and I made everyone in the house check their phones for the book, and obviously I was on 4 hours. I'm now getting down to three. I mean, I work a lot on my phone, but it's still bad. Um, and I pinned down a young man in the house, a trainee lawyer, and he was on 7 hours a day.
wow.
And he said, "Oh, I do it walking to work and coming home and this." And I just thought, well, that would be, a 40-hour week you're spending on your phone. So you have a whole work life
Mm,
where basically you're just looking at TikTok
mm,
and you're doing a full-time job as a trainee lawyer. And I just thought, what what kind of life is that?
Mm.
That is not real life. And how are you going to learn how to communicate, And also the partial attention thing is very funny. Like Netflix now tell people to write their
Yes,
series differently
yes.
because there's a whole generation looking at their phones and looking at the TV, so they can't follow the plot.
Mm.
So they have to repeat the plot at
Yeah.
certain points and you're just like, oh, for God's sake, you know.
Yeah, I was amazed when I read that. I had no idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, hilarious. But I think there'll be a big kind of backlash against that. I think it's already happening. But yeah,
Mm.
I'm really interested in how brains are forming differently as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to move to your Woman and Wine chapter. This is quite interesting. And so one of the things, I think you said that you've been more or less been sober for the past 6 years, and I wondered if you could talk a bit about your experience with that and how, I guess, it's changed how you feel or maybe how you view life even.
Yeah. Well, met a new partner and he doesn't drink. And I suddenly thought about 2 weeks in, I'd be slightly, on a different planet in the evening from him, even if I just had one glass of wine. I just thought, oh, I want to be on his planet.
Mm,
And for about a month, that was a little bit difficult, like going into a big room, a party or something at, 7 o'clock in the evening and having to talk to people I didn't know without a drink in my hand. But then I suddenly realized I was kind of living life in full color. I didn't have any hangovers.
mm,
I was having sex in full color, completely sober, which I hadn't really
mm.
done that much.
Yeah.
And everything was more intentional. And it was a little bit difficult at first, but then I really began to enjoy it. And people are
Mm,
far less negative than they were because you can get all these alcohol-free beers, and there's a whole
mm.
movement, there's a whole sober movement. And so
Yeah.
you don't feel like you're like the grumpy old idiot in the corner. You feel okay about it.
Mm,
And I also just didn't tolerate alcohol in my 50s as well as I had done. And, bags under the eyes, really bad hangovers after 2 glasses of wine. And before I didn't have that. And then
mm,
I found out that as you get older, particularly with the hormonal changes, and HRT didn't seem to make a big difference, your reaction to histamine changes, and maybe your reaction to sulfites in wine changes. A lot
mm.
of people can manage spirits, clean spirits, but
Okay.
whatever's in wine just gives people enormous hangovers. And, our livers are not processing as well as they did.
Mm,
And not having to deal with that means all the other bits of your body are functioning better. And then I obviously interviewed lots of women who'd gone into menopause and were really struggling, particularly in perimenopause, couldn't sleep, fighting with people, miserable at work, come home, open a bottle, get through even half a bottle or a bottle with their partner or whatever, but still every night, half a bottle of wine, maybe 4 bottles of wine going into that small woman every week.
mm.
Um, and even though you don't think that's serious drinking, or I had a few glasses at night, you're actually pickled. Over the week, your body's just constantly processing. It's not had a day
Yeah.
off. And I talked to also a wonderful woman who is now in Alcoholics Anonymous, called Caris. And she told me, and lots of, this was serious alcoholism, but it was exacerbated by menopause and by the
Mm,
hormonal changes and her looking at herself in midlife. And she just told me, some really shocking stories, which were actually quite funny, about what she went through
mm,
and coming out the other side. And also, I've met various people in Alcoholics Anonymous now, and I always thought it was a kind of distant place in church basements that's full of men. You know how that's how it's portrayed on all
yes.
films.
Yeah.
That's what, and they're always sitting on plastic chairs, and
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
always really depressing. And then I met lots of people in AA, and I actually went as a partner to an AA retreat, which was delicious foods and swimming and meditating and talking about ourselves. And actually, I sort of realized, wow, it's the cheapest therapy on earth. It's free. You can go to a meeting anytime you like. You can get support. You can listen to other people's stories. And we communicate with stories. And
Mm,
it's just having that supportive community around you. So, having thought that that maybe wasn't a thing to recommend to midlife women, Actually, yeah, I would. And there's
Mm,
lots of other ways and books and things, but that's pretty convenient
mm,
and really, really helpful. And you can do it online. And, you don't necessarily have to totally give up alcohol. I mean, I occasionally have a glass of wine when somebody graduates or something, I don't necessarily
yeah.
never, 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 but I don't drink day to day at all.
Mm.
And I love it, which is totally surprising to me, actually. I just, didn't think that would be the case.
It's not something that you ever like, I guess had like considered before. It was just like
No,
a,
it was just part
yeah,
of my life. Yeah.
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 I think that's so normal to have it to view it as just a normal part of life.
Yeah.
I wonder as well, you mentioned that the peak decade for divorce for men and women is in their 40s.
Hmm.
And I wondered if you could talk about how that's possibly connected to what's happening with perimenopause and menopause.
Yeah. Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, the mental health hormonal changes of perimenopause are huge. And I suppose that there's a great graph I show people, and it looks like a really mad roller coaster going up and down or in perimenopause. And basically your progesterone is going down like a slide straight down, and that's your
Mm,
calming hormone. And your estrogen is going up and down and up and down and up and down. And it sometimes goes much, much higher than even in your normal menstrual cycle. So
okay.
you're getting these enormous kind of estrogen hits, which
Mm,
can also cause the perimenopausal sex surge. Who knew about that word? And suddenly women get incredibly, their libido rockets up. And that is the time of affairs quite often for women too,
okay.
because they've been struggling in their marriage or whatever. So that happens. But you've also got the bunch of people who are having a really hard time mentally with their hormones. And there's that. But I also think that divorce is around sort of 45 on average. I think also people are exhausted, and women have borne the burdens, even though we think we are completely liberated and we're equal in our jobs. We are the people who are still taking the kids to the doctor. We are the people who are still looking after our aging mums. We are the people, on the WhatsApp group for school helping with something or other. And we are the people helping our colleagues who are crying at work. We are
Mm,
taking on these massive burdens of care for other people, and we don't have time to care for ourselves. And obviously, some people are brilliant at that, and they do. But most of us have an instinct, and there's also these hormones, which are the caring, loving, mummy hormones.
mm.
And when they go, bye bye, I'm leaving the building, you're like, oh, these people are really annoying. I'm really angry with them. I want my own life. And there is a kind of lifting of the veil. And,
Mm,
people talk about witches and crones and, older women being angry. But that softening duvet of hormones has gone. And sometimes that can just cause relationships to absolutely crack apart. So it could be either one of those hormonal things, a sexual peak, um, an anger peak, or just
mm,
feeling a bit crap and not
mm.
people not understanding you. And it's not necessarily men's fault or partner's fault. It can be just because nobody knows what's going on. And I also talked from my previous book to a couple of lesbian couples, and having, even though you're both in your 40s or 50s, having a menopause at slightly different times, and one of you taking an HRT and the other not, recipe for disaster. Even though you would think that would be easier, it isn't necessarily.
Okay.
You can just be kind of out of sync.
Yeah.
And one can have a hard menopause and the other not, and
Mm,
that can break up relationships too. So the more we understand, I think the better
mm.
it will be.
There's so, I mean, that's the thing is at the very beginning of the book, you were saying how there's, all these changes happening in midlife. And actually something that I wanted to ask you about, you said that one of those changes is, women being rendered invisible by the patriarchy. And I thought that was a very, I mean, so interesting. And I wondered if you could talk about what that's like, or, what have women said about that experience? Does it make them feel like liberated afterwards? How do they manage that?
Well, I suppose, yeah, there's a certain joy in not being bothered as you walk down the street, and also just being treated as a brain and not a
Mm,
body when you're going in to talk about something and to be taken seriously. So there is that. But then there is the invisibility that people in large companies are much, much more likely to employ a woman in her 30s than a woman who is 56 to do
Right.
a job. And there's age bias, but
Mm,
it particularly hits women, whereas a 56-year-old man is wise, a 56-year-old woman is, past her sell by date. And there is actually a physical thing that occurs in terms of pheromones that men recognize in their in their testosterone levels go up if a fertile woman enters the room. And it's nothing to do with anything or what they look like,
mm,
but they just have a slightly different reaction. They wake up a bit, they pay attention. Um, and that doesn't happen once we're past a sort of certain stage.
hmm.
And so I wonder about that. But I keep talking to women in their 50s who can't get jobs. They are not being
Wow.
considered for jobs. They've applied for 250 jobs. They are just too old. And I don't think it's quite the same for men. I mean,
Mm,
the job market has gone crazy, but we've also got these big surveys that we did with 1 in 10 women leaving their jobs because of
yeah.
menopausal symptoms.
Mm,
So we've got the health question, there's a sort of disability question coming up, mental health questions, and the struggle in the jobs market and not being valued,
mm,
and also maybe what if you are too strong-willed, too direct. There's a certain kind of old-fashioned thing that still exists, that if you come in and shout at people and try and reorganize them, that's not what women should be doing. And
mm,
there are these women of a certain age that will just go in and call people out and say, this is rubbish, that is rubbish, this is how we should do it. And people just go into shock sometimes still when that happens. And even younger women find that quite, disturbing.
mm,
Um, and so you do meet with opposition, but I just hope that that will change. And that, I mean, I keep thinking about politics all the time now, as we all
yeah.
do.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking of the older men running the political system around the world and who they're bombing and who they're not bombing.
Mm,
And I long, long, long for deeply experienced women in their 60s and 70s being up there going, this is why we need to calm down.
yeah.
This is who we need to look after.
Mm,
This is who we need to nurture. This is what we need to change. I just feel that our voices are missing,
mm,
and that maybe until we sorted out our hormones and we didn't lose that 10% layer or 20% layer of women, we should be working for life in politics, and we're not. And
mm.
I like to work in my space. I couldn't work in politics. I think it'd be very hard, but I know there are people out there who could.
Yes,
And, it's
100%.
amazing what you can change in just by shouting and talking. And, you know, particularly now that we have our digital powers that we didn't have before to reach a
Yeah.
huge number of people. And just
Mm,
even in terms of the menopause movement in the UK, I mean, we did a documentary in 2022, or 2021, and then in the year after, a year or two after, 1 million more women went on hormone replacement
wow.
therapy. And you think, well, that had a health effect on 1 million women
Mm,
just by, there was a huge menopause movement. It wasn't just the documentary, but we were part of that tipping point.
yeah.
And that came from women up. It did not, and a few, radical doctors. It did
Mm,
not come from the medical establishment down.
yeah.
Women went in and asked for that and advocated for themselves. And so I like the idea of us rising up in
Mm,
some sort of a way,
yes.
but with our hormones, intact as well.
Yes, yeah. Collective effort to make
Yeah.
those changes. Because I think, I mean, if we're not there doing it, I mean, no one else is going to be doing
No.
it. It's not going to come from the other direction.
No.
Something, I mean, we can't talk about your book without talking about the last chapter because I think this is awesome. Your psychedelic adventure. I wonder if you could share with our listeners a bit about that experience.
Well, I'm kind of surprised I did this, but I got really interested in how my brain changed on HRT and the profound effect of having, my serotonin receptors working again, all these things. And so part of my reading around depression and midlife, I came across a book by Professor Nutt at Imperial College, who'd written a book on psychedelics. And there's really interesting studies which show that taking psilocybin, which is a large dose usually of magic mushrooms, over maybe a couple of times, and they tried it on patients with treatment-resistant depression who tried all the antidepressants, and it made a huge difference to
Mm.
quite a large number of them, and allowed them to confront things in their past. Like perhaps there was actually a film of it. There's sort of a man who goes back into his past and he knows there's something dark in a garage in his childhood. He's got treatment resistant depression, and for the first time while he's on that magic mushroom trip, he's able to see the person in the corner of the garage, the man,
Wow.
and that man has abused him. But he's never been able to look at that, even though it's there in his brain, because he's so terrified and he's cut it
Mm.
off. But while the serotonin is pumping and giving you this enormous, glorious sort of psychedelic high, you can open doors in your brain that you were afraid to open, and you do it absolutely instinctively. And so when I went in, I did it in a really wonderful way in a group setting. So this is not a silly magic mushroom trip just playing. This is a big dose, and it was done by a counsellor who counselled us beforehand, made sure we weren't suicide risk or anything like that, checked, what sort of childhoods we'd had. Um, and then we went and talked together beforehand, 8 women on Zoom, about what we wanted to get out of the session, what we were hoping to kind of eviscerate from our minds.
Mm.
And people had all sorts of problems, difficult births, grieving their parents, not getting on with their husband, all sorts of things, struggles in their lives, or just not knowing, just feeling things weren't quite right. And my sort of own story was that my mum died of Alzheimer's. And in the last 10 years, I was looking after her and flying up and down to Glasgow. And obviously, she died long ago in my head before she actually died of Alzheimer's. It was miserable. I didn't get on that well with her. I left home when I was 18. I never went back. And I went back to see her, but I wasn't really connected with her.
Mm.
And then when I went on the psychedelic trip, and me and the neuroscientist on the psychedelic trip needed a double dose because we were so uptight. So when we had our double dose, the yurt we were in this mysterious European destination lit up with all different colours. And I was transported back to Glasgow with my mum in a circus tent in the Kelvin Hall when I was 6. And I was holding her hand, and the elephants and the ponies had just disappeared from the ring. And there's a strong smell of elephant dung, which I never smelt
Mm.
before, and horse dung. So you have this kind of visual, but also, you're smelling things. It's a sort of
Mm.
extraordinary experience. And then once that had gone, the circus had gone, which was amazing in itself. They had the dancing waters, and this is a long time ago. This is probably 1970 or something. And there were huge pillars of water that they played beautiful lights on, beautiful spotlights. So they were orange and pink and yellow. So it was like my first psychedelic experience. And beautiful music playing, tiny orchestra. Never seen an orchestra before age 6. So there's live music. There's this amazing light display, and I'm
Yeah.
holding my mum's hand. And my mum, who I thought of as kind of, in an Alzheimer's different world, here she is. She's holding my hand, and she's powerfully taken me into the exciting bits of the world. I think she's great. She's shown
Mm.
me this kind of vision of where you can go out in the world and find yourself and be creative. And so I have this intense feeling of love for my mum,
Mm.
for her opening up the world to me, which she did a great deal with finding books for me and things like that. But I really hadn't remembered that because of the last 10 years of misery and struggle for her and for
Mm.
me. Um, and so that was a wonderful experience, which I fact checked afterwards. So I went back and kind of Googled into the history of Glasgow. And indeed, there had been these dancing waters, but I hadn't
Wow.
remembered them. So it was a kind of memory that had closed down for me. And
Gosh.
there were various other memories of my parents, and I brought them up, and I felt quite, I'd got divorced, I had a difficult time, and I was getting remarried, and I also sort of felt good about my life and what my work was, and that I was doing something useful in the world. I felt a sort of sense of self-compassion, which I
Mm.
hadn't felt before. I just was thinking, you're not doing enough, or you should be, and so I had this sort of intense love for my mum and this self-compassion, and
Mm.
they have stayed with me. I mean, literally, that
Amazing.
experience was really, I was lucky maybe, but it was a really good experience.
Mm.
And so I'm really interested in it as a therapeutic experience for
Yeah.
for other people. And there's a lot of stuff, and I'm now thinking about researching this in the future, on eating disorders, recovering from anorexia, when nothing else seems to work.
Mm,
That can be really interesting. Having self-compassion, liking your own body,
yeah.
gambling addiction, alcoholism, all these things, as well as
Mm,
depression. And it just seems to take people above themselves and look
yeah.
down on themselves and think, oh, well, wait a minute, this is who I am. There's
Mm,
nothing. And so it doesn't work for everyone, but it sure as hell ain't dangerous. And, it'd be really interesting if it could become part of our therapeutic system
yeah,
in Britain.
absolutely.
And it really hasn't been tested enough on women. So I'm really interested in
Okay.
that, of course.
Is there anyone who is doing that
Yep,
research?
there's a group of women worldwide, and they're called Hystelica, like
Okay.
hysteria, psychedelics, women
Okay,
one.
cool.
So Hystelica are doing work, and I'm really interested in what they are going to do. I'll be talking to them. So who knows where that
Mm,
may lead? I don't know yet.
how interesting. Is there anything I haven't touched on that you would like to add?
Wow, you're so good at asking all these questions. I don't
Yeah.
think so. I just think that, well, actually, one of the things I loved throughout the book when I was writing was a book by Miranda July called All Fours.
Mm,
And she writes a beautiful piece of fiction about perimenopause and indeed the perimenopausal sex surge. And in it, she says, we've always thought of midlife for men as this time of great questioning and when they go into themselves. And I think, this is our time of great questioning.
absolutely. I like that. I think it's great
Actually.
calibration. I quite like that
Mm,
concept.
yeah,
Um and I think that was something that really came through was this idea of like positive change and reflection and then optimism for the future
yeah.
came
Well,
through
I
very
hope so.
strongly. Yeah. And so for our listeners, where can they get a copy? Because this episode will be going live on the release date of the book. So if they want to run out and grab a copy,
Yeah,
where can they go?
I think it'll be in all good bookshops. Order it from
Fantastic.
your independent bookshop if it's not there, and it's also available on Amazon. And I've recorded the audiobook myself,
Amazing.
so you've got me talking about it if you'd rather do that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kate, for joining us to talk about your book.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to have you again. And for our listeners, we'll make sure to put some links in the episode description so you can grab a copy.
Fantastic.